late spring of 1918, the Armenian army defeated the Turks in the Battle of Sardarapat. This occurred in the midst of the Armenian genocide and patricide, which was the destruction of an entire nation in its historical homeland. 500 years after the fall of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, the Armenian statehood was restored and the First Republic was proclaimed as the national flag was raised in Yerevan. This archival footage was taken on September 29, 1919. It is most probably the first time ever a camera filmed the Armenian national flag, although upon closer observation there is one another flag in the hands of Armenian soldiers, the banner of the United States. Where is it from and why? This film is about Armenia's relations with America and Russia over the past century. This is a story of love and betrayal. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." It sounded strange. The United States has long been one of the greatest power in the world regarding politics, economics and military might. Although, when exactly and how did America become a superpower? I think I know the answer, although many might find it odd. America became the world's greatest nation 100 years before Trump, and the reason for that was Armenia. More precisely, the Armenian genocide, which occurred in Ottoman Turkey. As early as 1896, the US Congress responded to the massacre of 100,000 Armenians in the Ottoman Empire with a special resolution calling on President Grover Cleveland to stop the Turkish pogroms. This was perhaps the first humanitarian intervention by the United States outside of America. You see a poster of a mass rally held on December 8, 1894 in Providence, Rhode Island, in defense of Armenian victims of the Turkish massacre. American newspapers and magazines of those years are full of reports, articles and illustrations describing the oppression of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Here is the Washington Post cover of January 23, 1896, with a figure of a woman stopping a Turkish executioner. This is not just an allegory of America defending Armenia from the Turks. Behind this symbol, contemporaries recognize the legendary Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross in 1821 during the American Civil War. This photo of 74-year-old Clara Barton was taken in February 1896 in Constantinople, where she arrived without official permission, where she obtained the consent of Sultan Abdul Hamid to establish an American mission of the Red Cross in Turkey to help Armenians, distributing food as well as organizing shelters for the orphans. Again, this was the first ever US humanitarian mission outside the country. The 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, personally headed the efforts to help the Armenians. Addressing Congress in 1904, Roosevelt called the Turkish massacre a crime against human civilization and even volunteered to personally lead a crusade to save the Armenians. Not everyone agreed with the idea to help distant Armenia. Here is a cover of Judge satirical magazine for March 1896. It ridicules official Washington's concern about the Armenians across the ocean, while aid could be channeled to neighboring Cuba. Here is another American satirical magazine that condemns the greed of the British government, who kept their silence about the Turkish atrocities. However, the vast majority of the American people responded to the call of Christian solidarity, perceiving the massacre of Armenians in Turkey primarily as a war of Islam against Christianity. In those years, the mainstream American newspaper, the New York Times, printed more than 30 articles about Armenia and the Armenian question. The 31st President, Herbert Hoover, wrote, "Every American schoolboy in the early 20th century knew almost as much about Armenia as he did about England. Mount Ararat and Noah were associated with Armenia, and Armenians as the first Christian people to be periodically attacked by Turkish Muslims. All this has left a mark on the American consciousness." Of course, the altruism and humanitarian efforts of the Americans were not limited to the Armenian case. Today, few people remember the unprecedented US assistance to the Russian people during the famine of 1892-93. Then almost 30 million Russian peasants became victims of drought and crop failure, continued to sell grain abroad, while prohibiting the press to mention the plight of its own people. However, there was one person in Russia who could not be silenced. The great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy appealed to the world for help in an angry article on hunger. "The people are hungry because we are too full. The villains who robbed the people have gathered, recruited soldiers and judges to guard their feast and enjoy it." Not a single newspaper in Russia dared to print these lines. They were published in the London Daily Telegraph. It provoked the anger of the Russian authorities. However, Tolstoy's worldwide authority drew the attention of the whole world to this problem. The people of the United States of America collected more than 10,000 tons of flour and grain for the starving in Russia. In the early spring of 1892, 2 American steamers with cargo arrived in Russia. Despite the attempts of the Russian government to belittle and forget these facts, they were preserved thanks to another genius, the great Armenian artist Ayvazovsky, who painted these 2 pieces in the spring of 1892, The 8th Ship and Distribution of Food. These paintings by Ayvazovsky were banned for display in Russia. The Tsar was irritated by the joy and gratitude of the Russian people captured by the artist, because it exposed the mediocrity of the Tsarist government, which had pushed the country into an abyss of famine. Ayvazovsky was so outraged and offended by the hypocrisy of official Russia that at the end of 1892 he traveled to America with these paintings, presenting his works to the Washington Corcoran Gallery as a gratitude for America's aid to Russia. From 1961 to 1963, the First Lady of the United States, Jacqueline Kennedy, chose these paintings for the reception hall in the White House. But let's go back to Armenia, divided between the Russian Empire and Ottoman Turkey. The US Congress, the parliaments of France and Great Britain reacted with harsh notes and diplomatic démarches to the pogroms of Armenians, demanding that the Sultan's government stop the violence. However, Russia's reaction was quite different. These are cuts from the 1929 Soviet documentary The Land of Nairi, made by the founder of Armenian cinema Hamo Beknazarian. As we see, it blamed the Russian government for inciting ethnic hatred between Armenians and Turks. Moreover, all these staged shots were filmed only 10-15 years after the Armenian genocide, when the survivors of those massacres were still alive. On June 12, 1903, Russian Tsar Nicholas II signed a decree that demanded the confiscation of the property of Armenian churches and closing of all Armenian schools throughout the Russian Empire. It is difficult to imagine a more treacherous blow to the very heart of the spiritual life, national culture and education of an already persecuted and oppressed people. Thus, Russia tried to destroy the very basis of the national identity of the Armenians, depriving them of their native language and historical memory. The National Art Gallery in Yerevan houses an unusual portrait of the Armenian Patriarch Hrimian. The artistic center of the canvas seems to be an envelope with a seal of the Russian emperor. This is exactly the letter by which the Russian Tsar informed the spiritual leader of the Armenians of his anti-Armenian decree. Catholicos Chrimian threw the letter under his feet without reading it and said, "May be forever cursed and destroyed this God-hating empire of evil and prisons." Many years later, in October 1987, another Armenian Catholicos, Vazgen I, reminded this prophecy of his distant predecessor to the 40th US President, Ronald Reagan, who described the heir of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, in the same words, evil empire. But Patriarch Chrimian did not limit himself to pathetic gestures. At his call, the Armenian population resisted the Tsarist gendarmes, who started to confiscate church and school property. From July 1903, rallies and demonstrations of protest against the Tsar's decree were held from Kars and Yerevan to Tbilisi and Baku. According to official data, the captured treasure of the Armenian church was worth approximately 111 million gold rubles. That is more than $1 billion at today's rate. In many towns and villages, the protests escalated into clashes with police and Cossacks. There were victims among the Armenian population. Hundreds of people were arrested. In October 1903, members of Armenian Social Democratic Party Hunchak attacked and wounded Prince Golitsyn, the viceroy of the Tsar in the Caucasus. On May 11, 1905, in Baku, the Dashnaks killed Governor Nakashidze. Frightened by the scale of the resistance, the Tsarist government in 1905 cancelled the confiscations and closing of the Armenian church, but instead provoked the massacre of Armenians in Baku as a punishment. Here is an excerpt from an old Soviet film when the justification of the Tsarist regime had not yet become the official policy of the modern Kremlin.
Мы бессильны обуздать татар, исконных врагов армян. Сердце обливается кровью, когда мы вспоминаем Баку. Впрочем, погодите. Что вы скажете, если мы выдадим вашему купечеству некоторое количество винтовок, так сказать, для самозащиты?
Я не знаю, как благодарить вас. День возмездия настал.
Отлично. Мы выдадим вам бумагу на получение оружия. Сегодня ночью пришлите подводы в арсенал. Только без лишних свидетелей. Русский престол всегда благосклонно относился к своим верным сынам, армянам. Пустите мусульман. Здравствуйте, господа.
Салам, джанабу полковник.
Да, я читал. Ваши опасения совершенно справедливы. Татарским районам угрожает опасность. Мы бессильны обуздать армян, исконных врагов татар.
Погодите, мне пришла блестящая мысль. Что если мы дадим вам, вашему купечеству, некоторое количество винтовок?
Так сказать, для самозащиты.
Аллах отблагодарит вас, ваше превосходительство. Кудафис, джанабу полковник, до свидания. Я вижу, вы начинаете делать успехи, дорогой Гаврил Петрович.
А я вижу, вам начинает нравиться восточная кухня, дорогой Вадим Аркадьевич.
However, St. Petersburg miscalculated the serious consequences of the Armenian uprising. This example inspired thousands of Russian revolutionaries, and although there is not a word about it in the Soviet and modern Russian history textbooks, it's enough to compare the dates to realize that the Armenian revolt of 1903-1905 became a trigger of the First Russian Revolution of 1905-1907. The tactics of individual terror used by the Armenian Avengers also became the main tool of the Russian revolutionaries. who killed several thousand Tsarist officials in the following years, including Prime Minister Stolypin and 2 interior ministers of the Russian Empire. St. Petersburg responded with new repressions. On December 23, 1908, Russian police arrested several prominent Armenian intellectuals on political charges, in particular the poets Avetik Isaakian and Hovannes Tumanyan. They spent several months in Metechi prison in Tbilisi. Then, Tumanyan was arrested again in 1912, and this time the great national poet was sent to St. Petersburg. The arrest of the Armenian intellectual leader caused an all-Russian scandal, so Tumanyan's legal defense was taken by lawyer Alexander Kerensky, the future head of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of Russia, who achieved his release. But pay attention to the chronology of the events. The Russian oppression of the Armenians coincided with dramatic political reforms of the same years in the Ottoman Empire, the adoption of the constitution and the coming to power of the Young Turks government. Both the Tsar of Orthodox Russia and the Sultan of Islamic Turkey treated the Armenians with the same suspicion and hostility, with their separate apostolic branch of Christianity, their ancient original culture, their own alphabet, and a network structure of national communities. Thus, on the eve of the First World War, Armenians found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position of a people divided between 2 rival empires, both of which saw them as internal enemies. The Caucasian policy of St. Petersburg was formulated by the new Caucasian governor who replaced Golitsyn, Grand Duke Nicholas Romanov Jr. Within the Russian Empire, the Armenian question does not exist and should not even be mentioned at all. The Tatar population is much more restrained and submissive than the Armenians, with their particularly restless blood in their veins. He was echoed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Sazonov. It is much more useful to help the Caucasian Tatars than the Armenians, who are already taking over the entire economy of the region day by day. The first will not think about their own state for a long time, while the Armenians still carry the delusional and harmful idea of creating an independent Armenia. Russia will do everything to preserve the integrity of Turkey in Asia. But the calculations of Russian politicians for the peaceful division of the Caucasus between Russia and Turkey failed pretty soon. On October 29, 1914, the German dreadnought Goeben, raising the Turkish flag, shelled the Black Sea ports of Odessa and Sevastopol. Thus, the Caucasian front of the First World War was opened. Russia joined the military-political camp of the Entente, along with Britain and France. Ottoman Turkey was an ally of Kaiser's Germany, which sought to seize the oil reserves of Baghdad and Baku for its army and industry. On the way to these goals lay the lands of Western and Eastern Armenia, divided between Turkey and Russia. Thus, the Armenian question became the center of the geopolitical interests of the rival camps. In the autumn of 1914, Tsar Nicholas II has appealed to the Armenians once again, this time not to close their churches and schools and confiscate property, but on the contrary, with a request for help. Armenians, after 5 centuries of despotic yoke, the hour of your freedom has finally struck. Your age-old loyalty to me in these solemn days is a guarantee that you are waiting to fulfill all your duties with unshakable faith in the final success of our armies. Armenians, united with your brothers in the Western Armenia under the scepter of my royalty, you will finally enjoy the sweetness of freedom and justice. In fact, it was an open and provocative call of the Russian government for the Armenian uprising in the territory of the Ottoman Turkey, which made the 2.5 million Armenian citizens of Ottoman Empire actual hostages of the Turks. On the other hand, the mass mobilization of Armenians into the Russian army had a very strange and, as it turned out, fatal feature for the Armenians. Let us quote an undoubtedly respectful source, such as Winston Churchill. When Turkey attacked Russian Armenia, the Tsar's government, fearing that the successful defense of the Caucasia by Armenians would dangerously inflame the nationalist aspirations of the Armenian race, conveyed 150,000 Armenian conscripts to the Polish and Galician fronts and brought other Russian troops to the Caucasus. Of these 150,000 Armenian soldiers, only a few survived the European battles or were able to return to the Caucasus before the end of the war. Churchill was absolutely right. The Tsar was not going to grant freedom to the Armenians as he promised in his pathetic manifesto. Russia's plans for Armenia were completely different. Already in February 1915, the Minister of Agriculture of the Russian Empire, Alexander Krivoshein, reported to Foreign Minister Sazonov. The successful development of our military operations on the Turkish front suggests that in the near future it will be possible to correct the Caucasian border in Asia Minor and Armenia for the widespread resettlement of Russians, which is most consistent with Russian interests. A year later, in July 1916, Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov reported, "As for granting broad autonomy to the Armenians, we should not forget that in the lands won from the Turks by our troops, the Armenians do not constitute a majority. After the punitive operations of the Turks, the ratio has changed even more, not in favor of the Armenians, who now make up only 25% in the territory of Western Armenia. Under these conditions, granting autonomy to Armenians will have truly unjust consequences, and Armenians cannot be allowed to enslave the majority Muslims." Recall that all this was written in the midst of the Armenian genocide, when in front of the Russian army and with its tacit consent, the destruction of an entire nation in its historical homeland was taking place. Of course, the Armenian people did not know and would not believe in the existence of such cynical intentions of the Russian government. Instead, the Armenians with heroic sacrifice followed the hypocritical call of the Russian Tsar. One of the brightest and tragic pages of the Armenian resistance in the First World War was the defense of the city of Van. The first ancient capital of Armenia rebelled and successfully defended itself against the assault of the regular Turkish army until May 6, 1915, when the Ararat regiment, composed of Armenian volunteers fighting in the vanguard of the Russian army, was the first to break through to Van. For the first time in 500 years of Turkish occupation, the national flag was raised in the cradle of Armenian civilization, on the shores of Lake Van, over the ancient fortress of the Ararat kingdom. The joy of the Armenians was indescribable. Rallies and demonstrations were held in Tbilisi and Yerevan. However, the holiday did not last long. 2 months later, on July 16, the Russian army suddenly announced a retreat from Van, giving people 4 hours to gather, after which it hastily left the city. The population could not keep up with the Russian cavalry. Seeing the retreat of the Russians, the Turks immediately attacked the defenseless city and committed a terrible massacre of tens of thousands of remaining inhabitants. Van fell because of the treacherous withdrawal of the Russians. It's impossible to call it anything other than a betrayal, as just 2 weeks after the seemingly unreasonable retreat, Russian troops suddenly returned to Van, facing no resistance from the Turks. The only difference was that there were no more Armenians left. Is it not for this purpose that the strange retreats and returns of the Russian army were made? No less cynical were the actions of the Russians in neighboring Bitlis and Mush. In mid-July 1915, Russian troops reached and stood at the foot of Mountain Nemrut, 300 meters from Mush. The slightest movement of the army forward would save the lives of several tens of thousands of Armenians. But the Russians were ordered not to move, and the guessing Turks, right in front of the so-called liberators, destroyed all the inhabitants of city of Mush with a total population of 100,000 people. In the meantime, on December 8, 1916, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Pokrovsky, instructed the Russian ambassador to Great Britain, Count Benkendorf. It is essential that an independent Turkish state be preserved in Asia Minor within the most extensive borders, which would be on our side in political and economic relations. It should be added that already during the war, Armenian refugees from Van were forbidden to settle in Tbilisi, the decree of the vice governor of the Caucasus, Prince Orlov, of July 11, 1916, and the order of the commander of the Caucasian army, Yanushkevich, of May 11, 1916, forbade Armenians to return to Alashkert, Bayazet, and Erzurum. Instead, Armenians were encouraged to move to Central Asia and the provinces of Central Russia. This is how the colonization of Western Armenia by the Russians was planned. Thus, despite the war, the goal of both empires was the same: Armenia without Armenians. Moreover, this goal remained unchanged when both these empires collapsed and new states arose in their place: Soviet Russia and Kemalist Turkey. And if not for one circumstance, the common goal of Turkey and Russia would have been achieved. What prevented the final solution of the Armenian question? In the spring of 1915, the whole world was shocked by the attack of a German submarine on a British steamer Lusitania. This was the first example of a military attack on a passenger ship, and world public opinion was outraged against the cruelty of the Kaiser's Germany. However, few people remember now that 2 months later, a German submarine sank another ship off the coast of England, this time an American one, which caused a sharp crisis in relations between the United States and Germany and largely contributed to America's entry into the First World War. So the American ship sunk by the Germans, by a strange coincidence, was called Armenian. The US Constitution at the time prohibited the US military from engaging in operations outside the country, and President Woodrow Wilson did a tremendous job of getting Congress and the people to change this clause of the Constitution. At the same time, the 28th President of the United States was by no means a supporter of war. On the contrary, he created a revolutionary political theory which was presented to Congress and the world on January 8, 1918, in the form of 14-point doctrine that became a basis of American policy in the 20th century. The Wilson Doctrine provided for the creation of a single world government, the League of Nations, the abolition of all secret treaties, the general reduction of armaments, the establishment of freedom of trade and navigation, the lifting of all economic barriers, the liberation of all colonial territories, and a 12th paragraph specifically stipulated the sovereignty of all nations under the rule of the Turks. Encouraged by Wilson's call, more than 3,000 young Armenians, citizens of the United States, hoping to bring the liberation of Armenia, volunteered for the front of the First World War to fight against Germany and Turkey as part of the American, British and French armies. Armenian young women enrolled in dozens as Sisters of Mercy. On April 14, 1920, Armenian veterans of World War I gathered in Washington, D.C. to ask the US government to help Armenia. On this picture you see US Army Major Varazdat Ghazanchian presenting Secretary of State Kolbe with petition asking to recognize the Republic of Armenia. If the defeat of Germany and Turkey was the main condition for the destruction of the former world order, then Armenia in the Wilson Doctrine was to become an example of the establishment of justice and a victory of humanism in world politics. The mandate for Armenia, which the League of Nations created at Wilson's suggestion, handed over to the United States, was a manifestation of a new world order that America opposed to the old European policy. It is the reconstruction of Armenia on its historical territory, according to Wilson's idea, that would become a symbol of America's new global role as a world leader. Naturally, the political revolution proposed by President Wilson faced latent hostility. The US Congress even rejected the president's idea of joining the League of Nations. As for the mandate for Armenia, Republican Senator Warren Harding, who succeeded Wilson as president in 1920, said, "I'm not indifferent to the suffering of Armenia, but I think America comes first. Security, like charity, starts at home." Isn't it a historically ironical reminiscent of the US President Donald Trump, who exactly 100 years later, in 2020, under the same slogan, America First, withdrew from helping and interfering in a completely similar situation of Russian-Turkish aggression against Armenia. Yet the efforts of American government, Christian missionaries and millions of ordinary US citizens have not been wasted. America could not save and preserve the Armenian Republic, which fell in 1921 under the joint occupation of Russia and Turkey. But America was able to save and preserve at least 130,000 Armenian orphans who survived the massacre, who were ransomed from Turkish captivity, fed and brought up in American orphanages throughout Armenia, Lebanon, Syria, with donations from the American people. It was them who became the basis for the revival of the Armenian nation, as tens of thousands of refugees became cells and centers of the Armenian diaspora in Europe and Americas. The reaction of the American people to the Armenian tragedy was phenomenal. President Wilson's call to save the Christian nation from total annihilation was answered by all segments of American society, all churches, schools and universities, charitable foundations, and millions of ordinary citizens. If the original goal of the Aid Fund for Armenia was to raise $100,000, then in the end, the private donations alone reached $91 million, not counting the $25 million in food and medicine provided by the US government. At today's exchange rate, this is about $2 billion. For comparison, we note that the government of Tsarist Russia in 1916 allocated for Armenian refugees an amount 100 times less, 1 million rubles, of which only 300,000 were paid. Most of the survivors of the massacre were children who were left as orphans. They became the main commodity in Turkey. They were sold into slavery, into harems. However, a certain number were saved into American shelters. In America, the fundraising for the rescue of Armenian orphans was headed by Jackie Coogan, a small Hollywood star, famous in Charlie Chaplin's film Kid. Dressed in rags like an Armenian orphan, Jackie the Kid raised a worldwide wave of sympathy and help for Armenian kids. Hollywood responded to Armenian genocide in 1919 with the sensational film Ravished Armenia, where the main role was played by the survivor, an Armenian girl, Aurora Martikian. As the 30th President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge wrote, "No private enterprise ever undertaken by Americans and in the name of America has accomplished more to arouse in the minds and hearts of the countries in which the organization has been carried on its operation a sincere regard and even affection for America." Of the 130,000 Armenian orphans rescued by the American help, 25,000 were gathered in the world's largest orphanage in the city of Alexandropol, now Gyumri in northern Armenia. They were fed, educated, taught arts and crafts, as well as foreign languages. These unique flash mobs of 1920 show the true attitude of Armenians to America. How much malice, lies and hypocrisy took to make Armenians forget about these pages of their own history. Any mention of this was considered criminal by the Soviet regime, which tried to destroy the national memory. Ironically, in these very buildings of the Gyumri orphanage, the Russian military base is located today. Meanwhile, on January 19, 1920, Great Britain, France and Italy recognized the Armenian state, giving the United States the mandate to determine its borders. Immediately after the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres on August 10, 1920, the United States began to work on establishing the southern and western borders of Armenia. The territory allocated to Armenia under the arbitrarial decision had been amounted to 103,000 square kilometers. These lands were added to the territory of eastern Armenia within the borders of the former Russian Empire, which were to be delimited later. In his report to the US Congress, the head of the US military mission in Armenia, Major General Herbert, wrote, "Better millions for a mandate now than billions for future wars." It is the footage filmed during the visit of that American mission to Yerevan that we used in the beginning of this film. On July 22, 1920, the government and the military council of the Ottoman Empire unanimously approved the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres. On November 22, 1920, the US President Woodrow Wilson signed a final decision on the border between Turkey and Armenia. On the next day, November 23, the Bolshevik leader of Soviet Russia, Vladimir Lenin, gave a secret order for the immediate occupation of Armenia. A week later, the 11th Russian Red Army, stationed in Baku, crossed the eastern border of the Republic of Armenia, simultaneously with the attack of Mustafa Kemal's Turkish troops from the west. On December 2, 1920, the joint Russian-Turkish occupation of Armenia completed the Armenian genocide, which had begun 5 years before. But the worst was yet to come. 100 days later, Soviet Russia and Kemalist Turkey committed the last act of the patricide of Armenians, the destruction of Armenian statehood, signing on March 16, 1921 in Moscow the Russian-Turkish Treaty of Friendship and Brotherhood, according to which these two unrecognized political entities decided to divide the Republic of Armenia. The most absurd side of the story was that at that time of the signing of the illegal Moscow Treaty, neither Russia nor Turkey controlled the territory of Armenia, since on February 18, 1921, An anti-Soviet popular uprising took place in Yerevan. Armenia restored its state independence for 50 days, until April 2, when Russian punitive troops suppressed the resistance of the Armenian people. Immediately after the Soviet reoccupation of Armenia, there began the mass executions, exiles, and repressions of thousands of citizens, the elite of the Armenian nation. But the almost forgotten 50-day national uprising, which then shocked the world, was not just an act of despair. It put history before the fact that the Russian-Turkish Pact of Lenin and Kemal was signed during the period of restoration of Armenian independence, that is, illegally, without participation and against the will of Armenia. The world, which has not yet recovered from the horrors, losses and destruction of the First World War, had neither strength nor a will for a new war with Turkey and Russia for Armenia. 2 years later, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed abandoning its alliance with Russia in favor of the West. The United States had not recognized the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne on the establishment of Turkish Republic, as it contradicted the Treaty of Seville and a mandate for Armenia sealed by the US President. Turkey did not raise a fuss about this, limiting itself to an internal decision to abandon the territory of Western Armenia for the Kurdish settlement. However, the forgiven evil never leads to good. Less than 20 years later, the criminal conspiracy of Lenin and Kemal on division of independent Armenia led to a new crime of a global scale, the conspiracy of Stalin and Hitler on the partition of Poland, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 undoubtedly had its precedent in the Russian-Turkish Pact of 1921. It is no accident that the 1939 agreement was signed in the same Kremlin hall under the portrait of Lenin, in the presence of triumphant Stalin, the co-author of the Russian-Turkish conspiracy of 1921. Meanwhile, 20 years after the genocide and patricide, the half-murdered Armenian nation was mobilized again for another war. Stalin sent 500,000 Armenian men to the greatest bloodshed in human history. Half of them, 250,000, never came home from the fronts of the Second World War. Stalin filled and bridged the gaps made by the mistakes of his generals with the bodies and souls of his soldiers. Those who survived were fighting bravely. The Armenian Taman Division stormed Berlin in May 1945 and danced the ancient Kochori battle dance at the walls of the Reichstag. Armenians fought with dignity against fascism within the American army as well, but the meeting of compatriots in Germany was dramatic. About 30,000 Armenian soldiers were captured as prisoners of war during the Soviet retreats. Half of them ended up in the zone of American occupation after the war. Returning to the USSR would mean for them a death sentence for betrayal or an exile in a Siberian gulag. In the concentration camp near German city of Stuttgart, Armenian prisoners of war who decided to emigrate to the US lived for almost 3 years waiting for the decision of their fate. They created their own little Armenia there, raising the national flag in celebration of the Independence Day of the First Republic on May 28, living, working, supplying thousands of Germans with scarce shoes, which they learned to make from old car tires. In the Armenian camp near Stuttgart, an Armenian school, a church, a theater, sport clubs were organized. Friendly baseball matches were held with American guards of the camp. Through the efforts of the great American First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, Armenian prisoners of war who wished to move to the United States received a residence permit, replenishing the Armenian diaspora. Let us recall that it was in America that the military and political leaders of Armenia, Garegin Nezhde and Andranik Ozanyan, were saved after the Soviet-Turkish occupation. The Armenians paid America back in full for their salvation. Writer William Saroyan, an artist Arshil Gorky, film director Ruben Mamoulian, singer Sherlyn Sargsyan, and show star Kim Kardashian have largely determined the face of American culture of the last 100 years. Today it's difficult to imagine the world without the automatic transmission invented in the 30s by Asatur Sarafian, also known as Oscar Banker, or without the ATM designed in the 60s by Luther Simijian, or without the magnetic resonance imaging scanner created by Raymond Damadian. We must remember that all these great Americans were born, survived, and served humanity thanks to the help of the American people who saved the Armenians. Of course, the creative gift and will to live were especially manifested in Armenia itself, where the remnants of the nation, which survived on mountainous peace of its stolen homeland, gave the world the music of Aram Khachaturian and Avet Terterian, the poetry of Charens and Sevak, the paintings of Martyros Saryan and Minas Avetisian, the cinema of Sergei Parajanov and Artavast Peleshian. However, the Soviet Empire did not deviate a step from the previous policy of colonialism. The slightest manifestations of the national spirit in Soviet Armenia were punishable by prison or death, as it happened with Charens, Bakums, Zabel Yesayan, then with Minas, Sevak, Parajanov. But the pendulum of history inevitably returns. If the collapse of the Russian Empire was triggered by the Armenian resistance to the closure and robbery of the churches and schools in 1903, then the fall of the Soviet evil empire was caused by the Armenian resistance that began in 1988 in Karabakh, which after Nakhichevan became a region of ethnic cleansing and assimilation by Azerbaijan. Like the Tsarist government in the early 20th century, the communist regime in the Kremlin responded to Armenian protests with pogroms and massacres in Baku and Sumgait. Like 100 years ago of the democratic movement in Russia, which 3 years later, in 1991, led to the collapse of the USSR. Armenia at this time was in the epicenter of all possible misfortunes. From the devastating earthquake to the 500,000 Armenian refugees from Baku, a total transport and energy blockade were added. Again, as at the beginning of the century, America extended a helping hand. Since 1992, the US government has provided $3 billion in humanitarian aid, food, fuel, and medicine to Armenia. My generation survived and raised our children thanks to the American humanitarian aid, the grain we ate and kerosene we used to bask in those terrible years of cold and darkness. How about Russia? In the post-Soviet decades, Russia virtually confiscated the entire economy, energy, mines, communication, transport infrastructure of Armenia. Meanwhile, in the same period of time, the army of post-Soviet Russia continued punitive military operations against Armenians in Karabakh on the side of Azerbaijan. A year later, during the anti-democratic revolt of the pro-communist parliament of Russia, in the autumn of 1993, Turkey decided to take advantage of the Moscow turmoil, and its Prime Minister Tansu Çiller reached an agreement with the Speaker of the rebellious Russian parliament, Ruslan Khasbulatov, about the neutrality of the Russian army in case of invasion of Turkish troops in Armenia and Karabakh on the side of Azerbaijan. Only the threat of US military intervention stopped the Turkish aggression and a new Armenian genocide. Here's what the former head of the Armenian Secret Service, David Shahnazarian, tells.
Ուզում եմ ես ձեզ հիշեցնել, Արցախյան պատերազմի ժամանակ Թուրքիայի ղեկավարությունը թե քաղաքական, թե զինվորական մի քանի անգամ քննարկել է այն հարցը, որպեսզի թուրքական զորքերը ուղղակիորեն մասնակցեն տեղ ունեցող ռազմական գործողություններին։ Եվ Ռուսաստանը չէ, որ նրանց կանգնեցրել է։ Ես կարող եմ մի փաստ բացահայտել, այս մասին մի անգամ մամուլով խոսվել է մի քանի տարի առաջ, ես ուզում եմ դա նորից բացահայտել։ Թուրքական գլխավոր շտաբի պետի տեղակալը, իսկ այն ժամանակ գիտեք, ներկայիս Թուրքիան չէր, այն ժամանակ զինվորականությունը նախորդ սահմանադրությամբ Թուրքիայի ըստ էության որոշիչ մարմին էր, հեռախոսային զրույց է ունեցել ամերիկյան մի բարձրաստիճան պաշտոնյայի հետ եւ պարզ ասել է, որ եթե մենք խառնվենք ռազմական առումով, ինչ տեղի կունենա, բարձրաստիճան պաշտոնյան ազգանունը չեմ ուզում տամ, նրան պատասխանել է, որ այդ դեպքում դուք գործ կունենաք Ռուսաստանի հետ։ Գլխավոր շտաբի պետի տեղակալը, թուրքայ գեներալն, ասել է, եթե ռուսների հետ մենք մեր հարցերը լուծենք, պատասխանը եղել է այսպեսին. այդ դեպքում դուք գործ կունենաք մեր հետ։ Սա պատմական փաստ է, ընդ որում որ այդ զսպման գործոնը կատարել է հիմնականում Միացյալ Նահանգները։
America has never forgotten the Armenian genocide. The United States was the first state where the massacre of Armenians by the Turks in World War I, as well as the extermination of Jews by the Nazis in World War II, were called examples of genocide. In 1951, in 1978, the US President Jimmy Carter declared, "The concerted efforts made to eliminate all of the Armenian nation is one of the greatest tragedies that has ever befell any group of people, and there was no Nuremberg trial of those guilty." On April 22, 1981, the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, remarked, "Like the genocide of the Armenians before it and the genocide of the Cambodian which followed it, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten." On April 24, 2021, the 46th President of the United States, Joseph Biden, officially recognized the Armenian genocide.
Gleaming on broad stripes and stars through the perilous light.
But a year earlier, at the 100th anniversary of the joint Russo-Turkish occupation of Armenia, yet another attempt was made to destroy the Armenian statehood and to complete, if not the genocide, then the patricide of the Armenians. In the autumn of 2020, with the consent and help of Russia, the ancient Armenian province of Nagorno-Karabakh was seized by Azerbaijan in order to establish a direct link with Turkey through the south of Armenia. And again, only the efforts of the United States and France thwarted this plan, written and designed by Putin himself. The 100 years that passed were stolen from the Armenian people. We can give birth to a new generation. We can bring back and rebuild our cities and temples occupied and destroyed. But we will never be able to return the time. These 100 years were the stolen century of Armenia. This century was stolen from all mankind.